On a cold Christmas Eve, Katerina Sullivan, a fiercely driven CEO of a thriving tech startup, is barreling down a snow-covered highway, her mind fixated on the next big business deal. Family invitations have been ignored, holiday cheer dismissed, all in the name of success. But when an unexpected snowstorm derails her journey, she finds herself stranded at her childhood farmhouse in Vermont, a place she's avoided for years. Forced to reconnect with her estranged parents and the warm traditions of her past, Katerina begins to uncover the cracks in the life she's so carefully built. As the snow piles up outside and the clock ticks toward Christmas morning, she faces a choice: return to the relentless pursuit of success or embrace a life where love, connection, and the spirit of the season reign supreme. What will happen when the snowstorm clears? Will Katerina leave the warmth of her family behind again, or has fate gifted her a chance at redemption? The sleek sound of fingers tapping on keyboards filled the air of the sprawling open office in downtown Boston. The space was modern and vibrant, with glass walls and minimalist decor, yet there was an undeniable tension in the atmosphere. Katerina Sullivan strode across the room, her sharp heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. She was every bit the picture of authority in her tailored gray suit, her auburn hair tied in a no-nonsense bun. Her employees knew better than to meet her gaze unless spoken to directly. Katerina wasn't cruel, but she was known for her demanding nature. Everything had to be perfect, efficient, and timely. She built her startup from the ground up, turning it into one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Boston, but her ambition came at a cost, both to herself and those around her. At the corner of the room, a young assistant with wide, anxious eyes shuffled through a stack of papers. Katerina approached, her piercing green eyes narrowing as she scanned the assistant's work. "This is incorrect," she said flatly, pointing to a figure in the report. The assistant stammered, her face flushing. I can fix it right away, Ms. Sullivan." Katerina's tone grew colder. "This was due an hour ago. Fixing it now doesn't undo the delay. Do you realize how important accuracy and punctuality are to this project?" The assistant nodded furiously, her hands trembling as she took back the report. Katerina turned away, already dismissing the interaction from her mind. She had more pressing matters to attend to. As Katerina walked toward her glass-walled office, her business partner, Michael, intercepted her. Michael was the opposite of Katerina in every way: calm, approachable, and perpetually trying to balance her intensity with a dose of humanity. "You've got to ease up on them, Katerina," Michael said in a low voice. "It's Christmas Eve. People are burned out." Katerina frowned. "We don't get to be burned out when there's a multi-million-dollar contract on the line. Holidays are irrelevant to clients, Michael." Michael sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not everything is about the bottom line. People need a break, including you. Maybe it's time to slow down, even if it's just for a couple of days." She shook her head, brushing past him into her office. The room was an extension of her personality, neatly organized, starkly professional, and devoid of personal touches. There were no family photos or holiday decorations, just a massive desk, a leather chair, and a wall-mounted screen displaying endless graphs and metrics. Katerina sat down and glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a notification. It was a message from her mother. "Sweetheart, the snow is getting heavier. Are you sure you don't want to join us for Christmas? The roads might be dangerous tomorrow." Her lips tightened as she read the text. Every year, her parents extended the same invitation, and every year, she turned them down. She could already picture their cozy farmhouse in Vermont, with its rustic charm and endless holiday traditions. It was so different from her life in Boston, too different, too slow, too sentimental. She typed a quick response. "Thanks, Mom, but I can't. I have a meeting in Canada tomorrow. Love you both." Setting the phone aside, she opened her laptop and resumed working. The snowstorm outside began to intensify, the wind howling against the office windows, but Katerina paid it no mind. Her focus was unshakable, her determination relentless. Hours passed, and the office grew quieter as employees trickled out for the evening. Michael poked his head into her office one last time before leaving. "Don't stay too late," he said softly. "And think about what I said." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the screen. When she finally looked up, the office was empty, the rows of desks and monitors dark and silent. Katerina stood and stretched, glancing out the window at the snow-covered streets below. For a moment, a pang of loneliness crept into her chest, but she quickly dismissed it. "Emotions are distractions," she murmured to herself, grabbing her coat and bag. As she stepped out into the biting cold, the city lights reflected on the icy sidewalks. Katerina had a flight booked for the next morning to Toronto, where an important client meeting awaited her. Christmas could wait. Everything else could wait. For Katerina Sullivan, there was no room for nostalgia or rest, not when there was always another goal to chase. The streets of Boston were eerily quiet as Katerina Sullivan drove her sleek black car through the city's deserted avenues. Snow flurries danced in the glow of the streetlights, hinting at the storm that had been forecast for days. Katerina glanced at the dashboard clock. It was past 11 on Christmas Eve, and she was on her way to the airport, her packed suitcase in the trunk. Her GPS chirped with directions, guiding her toward the highway that would take her north toward Vermont before crossing into Canada. She had planned every detail meticulously: an early morning flight from a small regional airport near the border, a brief stop in Toronto for a meeting, and then back to Boston before the week's end. The storm was an inconvenience, but Katerina had no intention of letting it derail her schedule. As she drove, the radio played softly in the background. A local station was broadcasting Christmas music, the familiar carols at odds with her determined focus. Katerina tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, her mind already racing through the pitch she would deliver to the client tomorrow. The contract was crucial for her company's growth, and failure wasn't an option. Her phone buzzed on the console. A quick glance revealed another message from her mother. "Please be careful, Katerina. The snow is getting worse. We'd feel so much better if you were here with us." Katerina ignored it, tightening her grip on the wheel. She had already explained her priorities to her parents. They didn't understand the pressure she was under, the demands of running a business. As she merged onto the highway, the snow began to fall more heavily. The once clear lanes were now covered in a thin layer of white, and the occasional gust of wind sent flurries swirling around the car. Katerina turned on her high beams, illuminating the increasingly treacherous road ahead. The miles passed slowly. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers was her only companion as the snowstorm intensified. Katerina leaned forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing as visibility grew worse. Her car's tires crunched against the snow, struggling for traction. She turned on the radio to check for weather updates. A somber voice cut through the static. "Travel conditions are rapidly deteriorating across the region. Heavy snowfall and strong winds are expected to continue through the night, with road closures likely. Authorities are urging residents to stay home and avoid unnecessary travel." Katerina frowned but refused to let the warning deter her. She was too close to turn back now. She adjusted her grip on the wheel and pressed forward, her focus unyielding. The highway seemed endless, an unbroken expanse of white stretching out in all directions. The occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction offered brief moments of reassurance, but the loneliness of the road began to seep into her consciousness. After what felt like an eternity, a cluster of red taillights appeared ahead. Katerina slowed down, her car inching forward as she approached a line of vehicles stopped in the middle of the road. She rolled down her window, the icy wind biting at her face, and craned her neck to see what was causing the delay. A man in a heavy coat approached her car, his flashlight cutting through the snow. "Roads closed ahead," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf covering his face. "There's been an accident, and the snow's too heavy for the plows to keep up. You'll have to turn around." Katerina's jaw tightened. "How long will it take to clear?" "Hours, maybe longer." "Honestly, you shouldn't be out here. The storm's only getting worse." She nodded curtly and rolled up the window, her frustration mounting. Turning around wasn't part of the plan, but there was no alternative. She executed a careful U-turn and began retracing her route. The return trip was even more harrowing. The snow was now falling in thick sheets, obscuring her view of the road. Her car skidded slightly on a patch of ice, and she gritted her teeth, steadying the wheel. As she approached the exit for Vermont, a thought crossed her mind. The farmhouse wasn't far from here. Her parents had always left the lights on for travelers, a beacon of warmth in the middle of the frozen countryside. Katerina shook her head. She wasn't ready to face them, not like this. But the worsening storm left her with few options. She took the exit, the snow-covered road winding through the dense forest. The farmhouse came into view, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. Katerina pulled into the driveway, her car crunching over the freshly fallen snow. She turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, her breath fogging the windows. The front door opened, and her father stepped onto the porch, his figure silhouetted against the warm light inside. He raised a hand in greeting, his face breaking into a wide smile despite the late hour. "Well, look who decided to come home," he called out, his voice carrying over the wind. Katerina stepped out of the car, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. She grabbed her suitcase from the trunk and made her way toward the house, her boots sinking into the snow with each step. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Katerina. We were so worried about you. Come inside, you must be freezing." The warmth of the house enveloped her as she stepped through the door. The familiar sense of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and the soft glow of the Christmas lights cast a cozy ambience over the room. Katerina set down her suitcase, her shoulders stiff with tension. "I was just passing through," she said, her tone clipped. "The roads were bad, so I had to stop." Her father chuckled, patting her on the back. "Doesn't matter why you're here. We're just glad to have you." Her mother wrapped her in a quick hug before bustling off to the kitchen. "I'll make some tea. You must be hungry." Katerina stood awkwardly in the living room, the weight of the journey pressing down on her. She hadn't intended to stop, hadn't intended to return to this place filled with memories she had worked so hard to suppress. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence. Katerina glanced around the room, taking in the familiar sights, the worn sofa, the crackling fireplace, the stockings hanging from the mantel. She told herself this was temporary, just a brief detour before she continued her journey. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed more than just physical distance tonight. Katerina Sullivan stood in the entryway of her parents' farmhouse, her suitcase by her side and the warmth of the home enveloping her like a blanket she wasn't ready to accept. The snow clung to her coat and boots, melting into small puddles on the wooden floor. Her father, James Sullivan, stepped forward, brushing snow off her shoulders with a laugh that seemed to echo through the house. "Looks like you brought half the storm in with you," he said, his blue eyes twinkling beneath his weathered brow. Katerina forced a small smile. "It wasn't my plan to stop here. The roads were impassable." Her mother, Ellen Sullivan, emerged from the kitchen, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. She wore an apron with flour streaked across it, a sign she had been baking late into the evening. The smell of cinnamon and ginger lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of firewood burning in the fireplace. "You've been driving in this storm?" Ellen's voice was tinged with concern as she handed Katerina the mug. "You could have been stuck out there. You're lucky you're here with us." Katerina took the tea and nodded curtly, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "It's just for tonight. As soon as the road's clear, I'll head back out." Her father chuckled, his voice a rich baritone that carried the ease of someone who had weathered decades of Vermont winters. "In this storm? You won't be going anywhere for a while. Looks like you're stuck with us, kiddo." Katerina's lips tightened at the thought. She hadn't planned to spend Christmas in Vermont, surrounded by traditions she had long since outgrown. Her life was in Boston, in her office, where productivity and precision ruled. Here, everything felt too slow, too sentimental, too vulnerable. Her father picked up her suitcase, brushing aside her protests. "Let me take this to your room. It's still the same as you left it, though your mother insists on cleaning it every few weeks, just in case you come back." Ellen shot him a glance but didn't deny it. "Your family, Katerina. You'll always have a place here." The words struck a chord Katerina wasn't prepared to confront. She followed them into the living room, her boots leaving faint trails of melted snow behind her. The room was exactly as she remembered it, as though frozen in time. The old plaid sofa sat in its usual spot, flanked by side tables holding mismatched lamps. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, adorned with ornaments she had made as a child, crooked stars, painted pine cones, and popsicle stick reindeer. The fireplace crackled, casting a golden glow across the room, and above the mantel hung the stockings, each one embroidered with their names: James, Ellen, Katerina. She set the tea down and took off her coat, glancing around with a mixture of discomfort and nostalgia. Her father returned, clapping his hands together to warm them. "Fire's going strong. You'll sleep like a log tonight." Ellen appeared with a plate of freshly baked cookies, setting them on the coffee table. "We weren't expecting you, but we're glad you're here. Come sit with us." Katerina hesitated, the weight of her exhaustion finally catching up to her. She sank into the sofa, the familiar cushions molding around her as if welcoming her home. Her parents took their usual places, James in his armchair, Ellen on the sofa beside her. The conversation started light, focusing on the weather and the storm's impact. But it didn't take long for Ellen to turn the subject toward Katerina's life. "How's the business?" she asked, her tone careful but curious. "Are you still working those long hours?" Katerina took a sip of tea before answering. "The business is growing. There's a lot to do, and I can't afford to slow down right now." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've been saying that for years, Kat. When's the right time to slow down?" Katerina's jaw tightened. "It's not about slowing down. It's about seizing opportunities while they're there. You wouldn't understand." The words came out harsher than she intended, and a silence fell over the room. Ellen reached out and placed a hand on Katerina's arm, her touch gentle. "We're proud of you, Katerina," she said softly. "But we worry about you, too. You've been pushing yourself so hard for so long." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "You don't even take Christmas off anymore. Remember when you used to spend days baking cookies with your mom? Or chopping down the Christmas tree with me?" Katerina shifted uncomfortably, the memories stirring something she didn't want to acknowledge. "That was a long time ago. Things change." Ellen offered a small smile, her eyes kind. "Some things don't. Like how much we love having you here." Katerina didn't respond. She glanced toward the window, where the snow continued to fall, thick and relentless. Eventually, the conversation turned to lighter topics, and Katerina allowed herself to relax, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of her parents' voices. When she finally excused herself to go to bed, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness in her chest, a mix of exhaustion and something she couldn't quite name. Upstairs, her childhood bedroom was exactly as her father had described it. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and the bed was covered with a quilt her grandmother had made. Shelves lined with books and trinkets from her youth stood untouched, a snapshot of a simpler time. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the quilt stitching. The house was quiet now, save for the faint creaks of the old wood settling in the cold. Katerina leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. For years, she had avoided this place, telling herself she had outgrown it. But now, surrounded by the echoes of her past, she felt the first cracks in the walls she had built around herself. As the wind howled outside, Katerina closed her eyes. She told herself she would leave as soon as the storm allowed, but deep down, she knew that something had already shifted. Katerina awoke to the sound of soft footsteps creaking across the old wooden floors. The faint scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted into her childhood bedroom, mingling with the aroma of something sweet baking in the kitchen. For a brief moment, as she lay beneath the familiar quilt, she felt a strange sense of comfort, as though she had traveled back in time, but the moment didn't last. Reality set in as soon as she glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was already past 8. Normally, she would have been up by 6, checking emails, drafting reports, and finalizing plans for the day. She reached instinctively for her phone, only to remember it was useless here. No signal. Sighing, she swung her legs out of bed and stood, wincing as the cold floorboards sent a shiver through her body. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the shelves filled with relics of her youth, trophies from debate club, framed photos of her high school friends, and a collection of dog-eared books she hadn't touched in years. As she descended the stairs, she was greeted by the soft murmur of her parents' voices coming from the kitchen. The house felt alive in a way her sleek Boston apartment never did. The fire in the living room crackled faintly, its warmth spreading through the small but cozy farmhouse. Ellen turned as Katerina entered the kitchen, a warm smile spreading across her face. She was standing at the counter, rolling out dough for what Katerina immediately recognized as her mother's famous cinnamon rolls. The sight stirred a memory so vivid it felt like it had happened just yesterday. Katerina, as a little girl, sitting on a stool and sneaking scraps of dough when she thought her mother wasn't looking. "Good morning, sweetheart," Ellen said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you sleep well?" Katerina nodded, though her sleep had been restless, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite settle. "It was fine. The storm doesn't seem to be letting up." "No, it doesn't," James said, looking up from the kitchen table, where he was reading an old newspaper. "You're here for the day at least, maybe longer." Katerina frowned slightly but said nothing. Ellen set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her without asking, just like she used to when Katerina was a teenager. "Sit and eat," Ellen said gently. "You need to start your day with a good breakfast." Katerina hesitated before sitting down. The chair creaked under her weight, and she stared at the plate for a moment before picking up her fork. She wasn't used to this, having someone else care for her, making decisions for her. As she ate, her parents chatted about small, inconsequential things, the neighbor's dog getting loose again, the decorations for the town square, the latest snowfall measurements. Katerina found herself only half listening, her mind drifting to the world outside. After breakfast, her mother handed her a dish towel. "I could use an extra pair of hands with the cookies. You always had a knack for decorating them." Katerina opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She didn't have work to do, not without her phone or laptop, and refusing outright felt unnecessarily harsh. She followed Ellen to the counter, where trays of sugar cookies, shaped like snowflakes and trees, were cooling. Her mother handed her a piping bag filled with bright green frosting. Katerina stared at it, the memory of doing this as a child bubbling to the surface. She had always been impatient, slathering frosting haphazardly across the cookies just to be done with it. Her mother had been endlessly patient, showing her how to make careful, deliberate designs. Now, Katerina found herself mimicking those lessons, her hands moving with a surprising ease as she traced the delicate outlines of a snowflake. "You haven't lost your touch," Ellen said with a smile, watching her work. Katerina glanced up, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "It's just frosting." "It's more than that," Ellen replied. "It's time spent together. That's what Christmas is about." Katerina didn't respond. She focused on the cookies, but her mother's words lingered in the back of her mind. The day passed slowly, the rhythm of farm life a stark contrast to the whirlwind pace Katerina was used to. She helped her father stack firewood on the porch, their breath fogging in the cold air. The task was simple but strangely satisfying, and Katerina couldn't help but notice how easily her father laughed, even at small things. "You work too hard, Kat," he said at one point, wiping his brow. "You should let yourself enjoy life more." "I enjoy my work," she replied automatically. "That's not the same thing." His words stayed with her as they went back inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold. That evening, they gathered in the living room, the three of them sitting by the fire. Katerina noticed the old radio on the mantel, its wood casing polished but worn from decades of use. Her father caught her gaze. "Still works," You know. Your mother insists on keeping it. Ellen smiled, sitting down with her knitting. It was your grandfather's. He used to play Christmas carols every year on Christmas Eve. Do you remember? Katerina did. The memory came rushing back, her grandfather's deep voice humming along to the scratchy tunes, the fire crackling in the background, the smell of pine filling the room. It had been years since she'd thought about it. Without thinking, she got up and turned the radio on. It crackled to life, the static giving way to the familiar strains of Silent Night. The sound filled the room, soft and warm, and for the first time in years, Katerina felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, nostalgia, perhaps, or longing. Her parents didn't say anything. They simply sat there, letting the music wrap around them. Katerina found herself sitting back down, her eyes drifting to the tree in the corner. The ornaments caught the light, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the gray world outside. As the evening wore on, Katerina felt herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. She didn't check her watch or worry about what she wasn't accomplishing. She simply sat, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a Christmas she had long forgotten. When she finally went upstairs to bed, she paused at the doorway of her old room, her hand resting on the frame. The house was quiet again, the only sound the wind outside. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she looked out the window at the snow-covered world. For years, she had been running, chasing success, chasing goals, chasing something she couldn't even define. But here, in the stillness of the farmhouse, memories she had buried were resurfacing, tugging at her carefully constructed walls. As she lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin, she wondered if she had been wrong to push it all away. Katerina woke to the soft creak of the farmhouse settling in the cold. Pale morning light filtered through the lace curtains of her bedroom, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. She stretched under the heavy quilt, her muscles still sore from the unaccustomed physicality of stacking firewood the day before. For someone who spent most of her time in boardrooms and behind a desk, manual labor had been strangely grounding, though she would never admit it aloud. Her eyes fell on her phone on the bedside table, its screen still devoid of notifications or service. She sighed. No emails, no meetings, no updates, just silence. Part of her found it maddening, but another, quieter part couldn't help but feel a sliver of relief. Downstairs, the scent of breakfast drifted through the house, eggs frying, bacon sizzling, and the unmistakable aroma of her mother's coffee. Katerina dressed quickly, pulling on a thick sweater and jeans before heading down the creaking staircase. The kitchen was a hive of activity. Ellen stood at the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes, while James read the local weather report aloud from his spot at the table. Still snowed in, he said, folding the paper. The plows haven't reached this side of town yet. Looks like we're here for another day, at least. Ellen turned to Katerina with a cheerful smile. Morning, sweetheart. Sit down and eat. We've got a busy day ahead. Katerina raised an eyebrow as she poured herself a cup of coffee. A busy day? Doing what? Her mother set a plate in front of her, stacked high with pancakes and drizzled with maple syrup. There's plenty to do around here. The tree still needs ornaments, the front path is buried in snow, and the chicken coop needs to be checked. Katerina blinked. Chicken coop. James chuckled. You didn't think farm life stopped for Christmas, did you? Despite herself, Katerina found a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had avoided the rhythms of this life for years, but there was something comforting about its predictability. After breakfast, Ellen handed her a box of ornaments. Katerina followed her mother to the living room, where the Christmas tree stood half-decorated. Boxes of decorations were scattered around the room, and strands of tinsel shimmered in the morning light. You can start with these, Ellen said, lifting a delicate glass ornament shaped like an angel. Be careful. Some of these are older than you. Katerina nodded, taking a strand of lights and weaving it through the branches. As she worked, her mother told stories about each ornament. The year Katerina had made the crooked star in kindergarten, the time James had accidentally broken a reindeer figurine and glued it back together so poorly they still teased him about it, Katerina found herself laughing more than she expected. Each story felt like a window into a time she had forgotten, a life she had once cherished but had left behind in pursuit of something else, something she wasn't even sure she could define anymore. By the time the tree was finished, its branches heavy with ornaments and twinkling with lights, Katerina stood back to admire their work. "It's beautiful," Ellen said, her voice soft with pride. Katerina nodded. "It is." The rest of the day unfolded in a series of small but meaningful tasks. Katerina joined her father outside to clear the front path, bundled in a heavy coat and gloves against the biting cold. The snow was deep, and the work was slow, but there was a simple satisfaction in each shovelful. "Not bad for a city girl," James teased as she tossed another load of snow onto the growing pile. Katerina smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Don't get used to it." When they finished, James gestured toward the chicken coop at the edge of the property. "We'd better check on the hens. They don't like being cooped up for too long in this weather." Katerina followed him, her boots crunching through the snow. The coop was a small, weathered structure surrounded by a wire fence. Inside, the chickens clucked softly, their feathers puffed up against the cold. James opened the door and stepped inside, gathering eggs from the nesting boxes. Katerina watched from the doorway, hesitant to step into the straw-covered floor. "Don't be shy," James said with a grin. "They don't bite." Katerina took a cautious step inside, eyeing the birds warily. One of the hens flapped its wings, and she flinched, making James laugh. "City girl," he said again, shaking his head. By the time they returned to the house, Katerina's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her fingers ached despite the gloves. But as she handed the basket of eggs to her mother, she felt a small flicker of pride. The afternoon was spent in the kitchen, where Katerina reluctantly agreed to help bake. Ellen handed her a rolling pin and a lump of dough, showing her how to cut out shapes for gingerbread cookies. Katerina's movements were stiff and unpracticed at first, but as she fell into the rhythm of the task, she found herself enjoying it more than she expected. "You used to love this," Ellen said, glancing at Katerina as she carefully arranged the cookies on a baking sheet. "I guess I forgot," Katerina admitted. Ellen didn't press further, but her smile said enough. As the sun began to set, the family gathered in the living room once more. Katerina sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her as she sipped hot chocolate from a ceramic mug. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room. James picked up a worn photo album from the coffee table and opened it to a page filled with pictures of past Christmases. There was Katerina as a little girl, her face smeared with frosting as she proudly held up a misshapen cookie. Another showed her helping James string lights along the porch, her laughter frozen in time. "Do you remember this one?" James asked, pointing to a photo of Katerina sitting on his shoulders as they picked out a Christmas tree in the woods. Katerina nodded slowly. "I do. It was so cold that day, but you wouldn't let me quit until we found the perfect tree." "And we did," James said with a grin. Ellen leaned over to look at the photo. "You used to love traditions like that. You had such a spark in your eyes." Katerina stared at the photo, her chest tightening. She had spent so many years chasing success, convincing herself that she didn't need moments like these. But sitting here, surrounded by the echoes of her past, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been wrong. As the evening stretched on, Katerina felt a strange sense of contentment settle over her. The small challenges of the day, decorating the tree, shoveling snow, baking cookies, had been nothing like the high-stakes decisions she made in her career. But they had left her feeling something she hadn't felt in years, connected. For the first time in a long time, she let herself relax. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in a hushed white stillness. Inside the farmhouse, the crackling of the fire provided a soothing backdrop to the warmth of the living room. Katerina sat on the couch, her legs crossed beneath her, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. The house had grown quieter as the evening deepened, her parents moving about with the ease of years spent together in this space. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, its lights casting delicate reflections on the ornaments they had hung earlier that day. Katerina found her gaze lingering on them, each one a reminder of a time she had tried so hard to forget. A crooked star, clearly made by a child's hand, hung near the top, its glitter faded but still clinging stubbornly to the paper. Ellen appeared with a photo album in her hands, its edges worn and the cover slightly faded. She set it down on the coffee table and took a seat beside Katerina. "I was going through some old boxes today," Ellen said softly, opening the album to the first page. "I thought you might like to see these." Katerina hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. The first photo showed a young Katerina, no more than 6, sitting on the porch steps of the farmhouse. Her face was smeared with flour, and she held a misshapen cookie in her small hands, grinning proudly at the camera. "Your first attempt at baking Christmas cookies," Ellen said with a chuckle. "You were so determined to do everything yourself." Katerina gave a small smile. "I vaguely remember that. I think I burned half the batch." "You did," James chimed in from his armchair, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "But we ate them anyway." Ellen turned the page, revealing more photos. Katerina stringing popcorn garlands, decorating the tree with her father, laughing as she threw a snowball at the camera. Each image was a snapshot of a childhood filled with warmth and love, moments she hadn't thought about in years. "You used to love Christmas," Ellen said quietly. "It was your favorite time of year." Katerina felt a lump forming in her throat. "I guess I grew out of it." Her mother looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "Or maybe you just got too busy." The words stung more than Katerina wanted to admit. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the fire. James leaned forward, his expression serious now. "Katerina, we're proud of you, more than we can say. But sometimes we wonder if you're happy." "I am," Katerina said quickly, almost defensively. "I've worked hard to get where I am. It's not easy running a business." "No one's saying it is," James replied. "But when was the last time you let yourself slow down? When was the last time you came home for Christmas, or even just for a weekend?" Katerina didn't answer. She couldn't. Ellen reached out and placed a hand on Katerina's arm. "We know you're chasing something important, but we miss you. We miss having you here, seeing you smile, hearing you laugh. It feels like you've built a life so far away from us that there's no room for family anymore." Katerina felt the lump in her throat grow, and she struggled to keep her composure. "I didn't mean for it to be that way. There's always so much to do." James shook his head. "There will always be more work, Kat. The world doesn't stop, but that doesn't mean you have to keep running yourself ragged." Ellen turned another page in the photo album. This one showed Katerina as a teenager, standing with her parents in front of the tree. Her smile was bright, her eyes filled with a joy that seemed almost foreign to the woman sitting there now. "I look at these pictures," Ellen said softly, "and I see a girl who was so full of life, who loved being with her family. That girl is still in there somewhere, Katerina. You just have to let her out." Katerina blinked back tears, her defenses cracking under the weight of their words. She looked at the photo again, trying to reconcile the carefree teenager with the woman she had become. "I don't know how to get back to that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You start small," James said gently. "You make time for the things that matter. You let yourself be here, really be here, even if it's just for a little while." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Finally, Katerina let out a shaky breath. "I didn't realize how much I missed this place," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I've been so focused on work, on success, that I forgot what it felt like to just be." Her mother squeezed her arm, her smile soft and understanding. "You're here now. That's what matters." James leaned back in his chair, his expression lighter now. "And as long as you're here, you might as well help me bring in more firewood tomorrow. It's going to be another cold one." Katerina laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. "I think I can manage that." The rest of the evening passed in a comfortable silence, the weight of the conversation lingering but no longer oppressive. Katerina felt a strange sense of relief, as though a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. As she climbed the stairs to bed, she glanced back at the living room. Her parents were still sitting by the fire, their heads close together as they talked quietly. The sight filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. When she reached her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the snow-covered fields. For the first time in a long time, she let herself sit in stillness, her thoughts no longer racing with deadlines and to-do lists. Instead, she thought about the girl in the photo, the one who had loved Christmas and family and the simple joys of life. Maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered fields surrounding the farmhouse. Katerina stood by the window in her bedroom, a mug of coffee warming her hands as she gazed out at the serene landscape. It had been years since she had allowed herself to simply stand still and take in a moment like this. The house was quiet except for the faint sounds of movement downstairs. She could hear her mother humming as she prepared breakfast and the occasional creak of floorboards as her father moved about. This wasn't the rush of city life, where every moment was packed with tasks and deadlines. It was slower, quieter, and oddly comforting. She dressed warmly, pulling on a heavy sweater and jeans before heading downstairs. The smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeted her as she stepped into the kitchen, where her mother was setting the table. "Good morning," Ellen said with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Katerina nodded, her voice soft. "Better than I have in a long time." "Good. You'll need your energy today," James said as he entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of wood for the fireplace. "We've got plenty to do." Ellen placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of Katerina, along with a steaming cup of coffee. "We thought we'd get a few things done around here before the big day tomorrow. The snowstorm set us back a little, but nothing we can't handle." Katerina hesitated. She wasn't used to the idea of pitching in for chores, especially ones that didn't have an immediate purpose in her structured world. But she nodded anyway, surprising herself with how easily the word came out. After breakfast, James handed Katerina a pair of gloves and gestured toward the backyard. "Let's start with the firewood. We'll need plenty to get through the next few days." Katerina followed him outside, the cold biting at her cheeks as they made their way to the woodpile. The morning air was crisp, the kind that made every breath feel fresh and invigorating. The snow crunched beneath their boots as James handed her a small axe. "Think you can manage this?" he asked with a teasing grin. Katerina raised an eyebrow, gripping the handle firmly. "I think I can figure it out." Her first few attempts were awkward, the wood splintering unevenly under her swings. But James guided her, his patient instructions helping her adjust her technique. Soon, she was splitting the logs with ease, the repetitive motion surprisingly satisfying. As they worked, James began to talk, his voice carrying over the sound of the axe hitting wood. "You know," he said, "when you were little, you used to follow me out here, insisting you could carry the logs yourself. You were stubborn, even back then." Katerina paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow despite the cold. "That doesn't surprise me." James laughed. "It shouldn't. But you had fun, and you didn't worry about whether you were doing it right or wrong. You just wanted to be part of it." The words lingered in Katerina's mind as they finished stacking the wood and returned to the house. She couldn't remember the last time she had done something simply for the sake of being part of it, without overthinking or strategizing. Inside, Ellen had set up a station for wrapping gifts. Rolls of colorful paper, ribbons, and tape were spread across the dining table. "Katerina," Ellen said, waving her over. "Can you help with this? I've got a few more to wrap before tomorrow." Katerina looked at the table, a little overwhelmed by the sheer amount of holiday cheer packed into the assortment of wrapping supplies. She sat down hesitantly and picked up a pair of scissors. "I'm not great at this," she admitted, holding up a piece of paper she had just cut unevenly. "That's all right," Ellen said with a smile. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be thoughtful." As she wrapped, Katerina found herself relaxing. The task was simple, almost meditative, and she couldn't help but laugh when one of her bows came out lopsided. Her mother laughed too, and for the first time in a long time, Katerina felt a sense of ease she hadn't known she was missing. By the afternoon, the family had gathered in the living room to prepare for the final touches of Christmas. James pulled out an old box of ornaments, carefully unwrapping each one from layers of tissue paper. "This one's my favorite," he said, holding up a delicate glass ornament shaped like a bell. "Your grandmother gave it to us the year we got married." Ellen smiled fondly, taking the ornament and placing it on the tree. "It's lasted all these years, just like us." Katerina watched them, a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at her chest. She had spent so many years focused on achievements and accolades, but here, in this small act of decorating a tree, her parents seemed to find more meaning than she ever had in any promotion or award. "Katerina," her father said, interrupting her thoughts. "Do you want to put the star on top? It's tradition." Katerina hesitated, her eyes flicking to the star he held out to her. It was the same one she had placed on the tree every year as a child, its edges worn from years of handling. "Sure," she said finally, standing up and taking the star. James steadied the ladder as she climbed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached the top. She placed the star carefully on the highest branch, adjusting it until it sat just right. When she climbed back down, her parents stood back to admire the tree. "Perfect," Ellen said softly, her eyes shining. Katerina looked at the tree, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't quite name. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what she had to do next or what emails might be waiting for her. She was here, in this moment, and it felt enough. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Katerina found herself sharing stories from her life in Boston. She talked about her company, the challenges she faced, and even some of the mistakes she had made. Her parents listened without judgment, their quiet support a stark contrast to the high-pressure world she was used to. "You've accomplished so much," Ellen said when she finished. "But don't forget to take care of yourself along the way." Katerina nodded, her heart heavy with gratitude and something else. Hope. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, she realized that she didn't need to have all the answers right now. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to simply be present. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned with a pale, golden light filtering through the windows of the farmhouse. Katerina woke slowly, the quiet warmth of the house easing her into the day. For a moment, she forgot the world outside her family's home, the pressing demands of her startup, the constant noise of the city, the relentless pursuit of success. Here, in this small pocket of stillness, time seemed to stretch in a way it hadn't in years. Downstairs, the house was alive with the sounds of preparation. Ellen was bustling in the kitchen, her cheerful humming punctuated by the clatter of baking trays and the rhythmic chop of a knife against the cutting board. James's deep baritone drifted in from the living room, where he was tuning the old radio. The familiar strains of A Christmas Carol soon filled the air, wrapping the farmhouse in its nostalgic embrace. Katerina stepped into the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and cloves greeting her like an old friend. Ellen turned, flour dusting her hands as she smiled warmly at her daughter. "Good morning, sweetheart. I was just about to start on the pie crusts. Care to help?" Katerina hesitated, glancing at the pile of dough on the counter. "I'm not sure I'll be much help." Ellen chuckled. "I'll show you. Besides, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be made with love." The words felt foreign to Katerina, who was used to a world where perfection wasn't optional, but required. Still, she stepped forward, rolling up her sleeves and picking up a rolling pin. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements settling into something comfortable and familiar. Ellen told stories as they rolled and shaped the dough, memories of Christmases past, of family dinners, of small moments that had slipped Katerina's mind over the years. "Do you remember the time you tried to make gingerbread men and ended up with a tray of blobs?" Ellen asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Katerina laughed, surprising herself with how easily the sound came. "I think I blocked it out. They were inedible." "They were," Ellen agreed, grinning. "But your father ate 3 of them anyway, just to make you feel better." As the pie crusts went into the oven, Ellen reached for a box of decorations sitting on the counter. I found these in the attic yesterday. They're from when you were little. Katerina looked inside, her breath catching at the sight of the handmade ornaments. There was the glittery star she had crafted in kindergarten, its edges uneven but lovingly preserved. There were tiny felt stockings she had stitched with her mother, each one marked with a name: James, Ellen, Katerina. I can't believe you kept these, she said softly, running her fingers over the worn felt. Of course we did, Ellen replied. They're part of our story. The simple statement hit Katerina harder than she expected. For so long, she had been running forward, always chasing the next goal, the next milestone, the next big success. She had forgotten what it felt like to look back, to cherish the moments that had shaped her. As the day wore on, the farmhouse became a hub of quiet activity. Katerina helped her father carry the last of the firewood into the house, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. She tied ribbons around gifts with her mother, their hands working in tandem as they reminisced about Christmas mornings gone by. By evening, the house was transformed. The tree sparkled with lights and ornaments, its base surrounded by carefully wrapped presents. The scent of the holiday feast filled the air: roast turkey, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, and Ellen's famous apple pie cooling on the windowsill. They sat down to dinner as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft, golden glow. The table was laden with food, each dish prepared with care and tradition. Katerina sat between her parents, a glass of spiced cider in her hand, and for the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of belonging. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of glasses. Katerina found herself opening up, sharing stories about her life in Boston, the challenges she faced, and even the moments of doubt she rarely admitted to anyone. You've done so much, James said, his voice filled with pride. But don't forget to leave room for yourself in the process. Katerina nodded, her chest tightening. I think I forgot what that even looks like. Ellen reached across the table and took Katerina's hand. You're finding your way back. That's what matters. After dinner, they gathered in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. James turned on the radio, and a familiar Christmas song filled the room. Ellen stood and extended her hand to Katerina. Dance with me, she said, her smile inviting and warm. Katerina laughed, shaking her head. I haven't danced since college. Then it's about time, Ellen replied, pulling her daughter to her feet. They swayed to the music, their laughter filling the room. James joined them, his deep voice humming along to the melody. Katerina felt something loosen inside her, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. As the night wore on, they opened a single gift each, a family tradition Katerina had nearly forgotten. Her parents gave her a small, intricately carved wooden box. What's this? She asked, running her fingers over the smooth surface. Open it, James said, his smile soft. Inside was a small collection of photos, Katerina as a child, her family together during past Christmases, moments frozen in time. There was also a letter, written in her mother's neat handwriting. It's a reminder, Ellen said. Of where you come from. Of what's always waiting for you. Katerina felt her throat tighten as she looked at the photos, the memories flooding back with startling clarity. She hugged her parents tightly, the words, thank you, barely escaping her lips. Later, as she lay in bed, she held the box close, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. For the first time in years, she felt at peace, not because she had accomplished something, but because she had allowed herself to simply be. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed to blanket the world alongside the snow. Katerina woke to the faint sounds of her parents moving through the house, the soft hum of her mother's singing, the rhythmic tapping of her father's steps as he carried wood to the fireplace. The faint smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of pine from the Christmas tree downstairs. Katerina stretched beneath the warmth of the quilt, her mind lingering on the events of the past few days. There was a calm in her chest she hadn't felt in years, but it was tinged with an undercurrent of uncertainty. She had come here by accident, yet somehow, it felt as though she had been meant to pause and remember what she had left behind. She dressed warmly before heading downstairs. The living room was aglow with soft morning light filtering through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the tree and its neatly wrapped gifts. James sat in his armchair, sipping coffee and stoking the fire, while Ellen arranged the last touches to their breakfast on the kitchen table. "Good morning, sweetheart," Ellen said with a bright smile as Katerina entered. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," Katerina replied, her voice still quiet from sleep. James grinned from his chair, holding up a mug of coffee. "Come sit. There's plenty of coffee to get you going, and I think your mom's been up since dawn cooking enough food for an army." Ellen waved a hand dismissively. "It's tradition. Besides, Christmas breakfast has to be special." The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, the spread a perfect reflection of Ellen's love for the season. There were fluffy pancakes drizzled with maple syrup, crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, and freshly baked muffins still warm from the oven. Katerina felt a pang of guilt as she realized how many of these traditions she had missed over the years. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, a mixture of light-hearted teasing and heartfelt reminiscence. Katerina found herself smiling more than she had in months, the simple act of being present with her parents filling her with a sense of contentment she hadn't realized she was capable of anymore. After breakfast, they moved to the living room to exchange gifts. The tree sparkled with lights, and Katerina couldn't help but feel a flicker of the childhood excitement she had once felt on Christmas morning. Ellen handed her a neatly wrapped box, the paper decorated with tiny snowflakes. "This one's for you," Ellen said, her eyes shining. Katerina opened it carefully, her fingers running over the edges of the paper. Inside was a soft, hand-knitted scarf in deep green, the stitches intricate and precise. "I made it for you," Ellen said, her voice soft. "Something to keep you warm when you're out in that big city of yours." Katerina ran her fingers over the yarn, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful, Mom." "Thank you." As the morning unfolded, the pile of gifts under the tree grew smaller, the room filling with the sound of torn wrapping paper and the laughter of shared memories. But amidst the warmth and joy, a thought kept tugging at the edge of Katerina's mind. Later, as her parents stepped into the kitchen to prepare for Christmas dinner, Katerina lingered by the tree. She picked up the small wooden box her parents had given her the night before and opened it again. Inside, the photos stared back at her, snapshots of a simpler time, moments filled with love and connection. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "It's a reminder of where you come from." Katerina realized that she had been so focused on her career, so consumed by the drive to achieve and excel, that she had lost sight of the values her parents had instilled in her. For years, she had told herself there was no other way, that success required sacrifice, but now she wasn't so sure. James returned to the living room, holding a plate of cookies and a steaming mug of cider. He noticed the box in Katerina's hands and sat down beside her. "Thinking about the past?" he asked gently. Katerina nodded. "A lot, actually." James took a sip of his cider before speaking. "You've built something incredible out there, Kat. We're proud of you, always have been. But sometimes, I wonder if you've given too much of yourself to it." Katerina looked at her father, his face weathered but kind, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived a long and full life. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean balance," he said simply. "It's easy to get so caught up in chasing success that you forget what it's all for. At the end of the day, what matters most isn't how much you've achieved, but who you've shared it with." Katerina stared down at the box in her hands, her mind racing. She thought about her assistant, the one she had reprimanded so harshly just days ago. She thought about the long hours she demanded from her team, the sacrifices they made at the expense of their own families. And she thought about herself, sitting alone in her Boston apartment night after night, surrounded by accolades that suddenly felt hollow. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been so focused on work that I've let everything else fall away. I don't even know how to fix it." James smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You start small. You look for ways to bring balance back into your life. And you remember that it's okay to ask for help." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, preparing the holiday feast, setting the table, and welcoming a few neighbors who had braved the snow to stop by and share a meal. Katerina found herself fully present in each moment, her mind free of the constant pressure to plan and execute. As the evening wound down, she found herself sitting by the fire with her parents, a plate of pie in her lap. The conversation turned toward the future, and Katerina finally voiced the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind all day. "When I go back to Boston," she said, her voice steady, "I'm going to make some changes. At work, with myself, everything." Ellen smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "That's a wonderful start." Katerina looked at her parents, the love and support in their expressions filling her with a newfound sense of determination. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let another year go by without finding the balance her life so desperately needed. As the fire crackled softly, Katerina leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the world transformed into a pristine white wonderland. The morning sun sparkled across the fields, the snow glittering like diamonds as Katerina stepped out onto the porch. She had her suitcase in hand, the scarf her mother had knitted wrapped snugly around her neck. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp winter air as she looked out over the landscape. Her parents stood with her, James carrying her suitcase down the porch steps to her car while Ellen lingered by her side. The warmth of the last few days still lingered in Katerina's chest, though she couldn't ignore the pang of sadness that came with the realization that it was time to leave. "You know," Ellen said softly, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, "you're always welcome here, Katerina. Anytime." "I know," Katerina replied, her voice equally soft. "And I'll come back. I promise." Ellen's eyes glistened as she pulled her daughter into a hug. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for the person you are. Never forget that." Katerina swallowed the lump in her throat, hugging her mother tightly. "I won't." James returned, brushing snow off his hands. "Your car's all set. Roads look clear enough, but take it slow, all right?" Katerina nodded, her gaze lingering on her father. "Thanks, Dad. For everything." He pulled her into a bear hug, patting her back. "Anytime, kiddo." As she climbed into her car and started the engine, she glanced back at the farmhouse. The memories of the past few days played in her mind, decorating the tree, baking cookies, sitting by the fire with her parents. For years, she had convinced herself she didn't need those moments, but now, she couldn't imagine her life without them. She waved as she drove down the snow-covered driveway, her parents standing on the porch until she disappeared around the bend. The drive back to Boston felt different. The highway was no longer just a corridor of opportunity, a means to reach the next goal. Katerina allowed herself to take in the scenery, the snow-covered trees, the frozen rivers, the small towns bustling with holiday cheer. She felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. By the time she reached her apartment, the city had come alive with its usual energy. The streets were filled with people rushing to and from, the noise and motion a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of Vermont. But Katerina didn't feel overwhelmed. For the first time in years, she felt grounded. Her apartment was just as she had left it, immaculate, modern, and devoid of personal touches. As she set her suitcase down and looked around, she realized how sterile it seemed compared to the farmhouse. There were no signs of life here, no warmth, no history. Katerina pulled out the wooden box her parents had given her and placed it on the coffee table. She opened it, letting the photos spill out across the glass surface. Each one was a reminder of what truly mattered: family, connection, love. She spent the next few hours making small but meaningful changes. The scarf her mother had knitted found a home draped over the back of her chair. A photo of her parents from one of the Christmases long ago was placed on the bookshelf. She even pulled out a few holiday decorations she had ignored for years, setting them around the apartment to bring a touch of warmth to the space. The next morning, Katerina returned to her office. The sleek glass building was as imposing as ever, the hum of productivity palpable the moment she stepped inside. Her assistant greeted her with a tentative smile, clearly surprised to see her back so soon after the holidays. "Good morning, Ms. Sullivan," the assistant said, holding out a stack of papers. "I have the quarterly reports ready for your review." Katerina took the papers but paused, looking at the young woman. She remembered the moment just a few days ago when she had reprimanded her harshly, the shame of it still lingering. "Thank you," Katerina said, her tone softer than usual. "And by the way, I want to apologize for the way I spoke to you before I left. It was unfair, and I'm sorry." The assistant's eyes widened in surprise, and she nodded quickly. "Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. I appreciate that." Katerina smiled, watching as the assistant walked away. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step toward creating the kind of environment she wanted to build, one that valued people as much as it valued success. She spent the day reviewing her company's policies, drafting ideas for new initiatives that prioritized balance and well-being for her employees. Flexible schedules, mental health support, and better recognition of their hard work were all part of her plan. Katerina realized that success didn't have to come at the expense of humanity. Over the next few weeks, the changes began to take shape. Katerina took time to connect with her team, listening to their concerns and ideas. She encouraged them to take breaks, spend time with their families, and find joy outside of work. For herself, she began setting boundaries. No more answering emails at midnight, no more sacrificing weekends for meetings. She started visiting her parents regularly, rediscovering the simple pleasures of being home. One evening, as she sat by the window of her apartment, a cup of tea in her hands, Katerina reflected on how far she had come. The woman she had been just a few weeks ago felt like a distant memory, someone driven by ambition but disconnected from the world around her. Now, she felt whole, grounded in a way she hadn't thought possible. The wooden box sat on the coffee table, a constant reminder of where she came from and what truly mattered. As the city lights twinkled outside, Katerina smiled to herself. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.